A pilot's worst mistakes ended in a deadly tragedy when he was moments away from landing and the aircraft he was flying slammed into the ground and caught on fire. Unfortunately, the most tragic part of the story is that the mistakes caused the death of the pilot's own brother. That's why we're going to look at what really happened during the final moments of the flight and the shocking truth about why this never should have happened. I'm Hoover, and welcome to your Pilot Debrief. Our story begins on January 5th, 2014, when 3 pilots flew a private jet from Mexico to Tucson, Arizona for a brief stop before continuing their journey to Aspen, Colorado. The aircraft they were flying was a 1994 Bombardier Challenger 601, and according to the investigation, there was nothing mechanically wrong with the aircraft that contributed to the crash. That's why the NTSB quickly focused their investigation on who was flying the plane. The pilot sitting in the left seat was Arturo Barbada. He was 52 years old and he had an airline transport pilot certificate issued in Mexico where he had logged over 17,000 hours of flight time, and he had flown the Airbus A320 for Mexicana, which was Mexico's oldest airline until it went out of business in 2010. About 2 months prior to the tragedy, Arturo attended flight training in Dallas, Texas to obtain a type rating that was needed to fly the accident aircraft. During his training, he had some trouble with the aircraft flight management system, but he still received a satisfactory rating and earned his FAA commercial certificate. However, at the time of the crash, he didn't have a lot of experience in the Challenger. In fact, he only had about 14 hours of flight time in the accident aircraft, but that was consisting of a ferry flight from Dallas to Mexico and a flight from Mexico to Eagle, Colorado and back. Sitting in the right seat of the aircraft was Arturo's brother. 54-year-old Emilio Barbada had a very similar background flying for Mexicana, and he had over 20,000 hours of total flight time, but he too only had about 14 hours in the accident aircraft. Emilio went through training at the same time as his brother, but Emilio received an unsatisfactory at the completion of his training check ride because of problems he had conducting a missed approach. However, he was eventually retested and passed on his second check ride. According to the investigation, because the brothers each had less than 25 hours of flight time in the Challenger, they weren't allowed to serve as the pilot in command of the aircraft when carrying passengers or cargo for hire, and that brings us to the third person flying with them that day. Miguel Enriquez was 52 years old, and even though he had an FAA commercial pilot certificate, he was considered a passenger because he was riding in the jump seat behind the pilots, and he wasn't in a position to manage the controls of the aircraft. Miguel didn't pay to be on the trip, and the reason he was on the flight was because Arturo invited him because he said Miguel was an experienced pilot in the Challenger, and he figured that Miguel could help give them some recommendations because of the special conditions at Aspen. However, the truth is that Miguel's FAA certificate didn't include a type rating on this aircraft, and the NTSB didn't provide any additional details on Miguel's experience flying a Challenger or how many times he had been to Aspen before. The NTSB also didn't say what the purpose of the flight was, but my guess is that Arturo and Emilio were just trying to build some hours so they could eventually conduct private charter flights in the aircraft. Unfortunately, regardless of the reason for the trip, the pilots might not have realized that Aspen is one of the most dangerous airports in the United States. The Aspen-Pitkin County Airport sits in the Roaring Fork Valley in the middle of the Rocky Mountains at an elevation of 7,820 feet. Because of the high terrain surrounding the field, the airport is essentially one way in and one way out. That means all of the instrument approaches are to the south as aircraft are expected to land on runway 15. When you leave, all the departure procedures are to the north on runway 33, and you need to meet special climb requirements to get above the mountains. The high elevation of the airport also means density altitude is going to be a factor in your aircraft performance, and aircraft need more runway to take off and land. That's one of the reasons why the runway is 8,000 feet long. If that's not enough, the airport has over 24 remarks that pilots need to pay attention to, including warnings that the terrain will not allow for normal traffic patterns, high rates of descent might be required to land, and don't forget that all adverse weather situations are magnified in the mountains. When it comes to the weather, on the morning of the tragedy, there was a light snowfall and there were instrument flying conditions in Aspen. However, the weather was getting better throughout the day, and by the time the pilots departed Tucson, the forecast was calling for visual flight conditions with showers in the vicinity, with scattered clouds at 4,000 feet and broken clouds at 5,000 feet. This meant that even though the weather was good enough for a visual approach, the pilots would need to fly an instrument approach to get below the clouds, and this might seem routine for pilots with 17 to 20,000 hours of flight time. Unfortunately, this was anything but routine, and the approach into Aspen had multiple challenges that the pilots seemed to be unaware of. One of the most important things that you can do as a pilot, especially when you're flying into an airport that you've never been to, is conduct a very thorough approach briefing. You need to make sure that the FMS is programmed correctly, and you need to understand how to fly the approach and what to do if you can't see the runway or if you're not in a position to land once you get below the weather. This is not a simple approach, and it would take too long to explain it all in this video, so that's why I'm going to highlight some of the big issues that you need to be aware of, so that way everyone understands the challenges of flying here. The approach brings you down the east side of the valley because if you can't land, you need room to turn around and head north going out the west side of the valley. This is part of the missed approach, but in order to do that, dual VHF navigation receivers are required. This is because you need to have the localizer frequency set for the approach while also having a second localizer frequency to fly the missed approach. You don't want to be heads down trying to change frequencies while you're executing that missed approach. However, the real reason you need two receivers is because when you're flying the missed approach, you need to have the red table VOR tuned in order to find the 244 radial to identify this point, lens. The biggest challenge for a lot of pilots the first time they fly into Aspen is understanding the descent profile you need to get down to the runway. If we go back to the localizer approach, these are the altitudes that you have to be at or above at each corresponding point on the approach. The problem is the higher you are above those altitudes, the more challenging this approach is going to be. Assuming you started this approach at Yargoo at 13,400 feet, you'd have a comfortable rate of descent until the final approach fix. However, once you cross that point, your descent profile increases to a staggering 6.59 degrees. That's more than double the typical 3-degree flight path that most pilots are used to. You also need to be aware that once you get down to your minimum descent altitude, you're still going to be 2,000 to 3,000 feet above the runway. Now, this might not be a big problem if you're flying at 80 to 90 knots ground speed, but the truth is that Arturo would average 130 to 140 knots, and that meant he was going to need to descend a lot faster in order to get the aircraft stabilized and in a position to land. Unfortunately, I think one of the big mistakes that the flight crew made is they most likely never conducted a detailed approach briefing to talk about any of the dangers associated with this approach. Instead, as you're about to find out, they were completely unprepared for what was about to happen. The cockpit voice recorder was one of the most helpful pieces of evidence in this investigation. Now, the recording only captured the last 30 minutes of the flight, and for reference as we go through it, Hot 1 is Arturo, and he's the pilot flying in the left seat. Hot 2 is Emilio, and he's the pilot monitoring and talking on the radios in the right seat. And Hot 3 is Miguel, sitting in the jump seat, and he's supposed to be the one with experience flying into Aspen. As soon as they were cleared for the approach, everything started to fall apart. Arturo called for flaps 20, but Emilio said they're already there, and he mentioned flaps 30. Emilio asked if they should put the landing gear down. Arturo said yes, but Emilio wasn't so sure. However, he lowered the landing gear anyway. 10 seconds later, Arturo seemed confused about the localizer signal, but Miguel told him it's because they didn't load the approach in the FMS. Moments later, they were told to contact the tower, and Arturo was still worried about being high. Miguel was still trying to tell him that he was good. Unfortunately, he's not, and at least Arturo recognized that they were 11 miles from the runway and 7,000 feet high. If you haven't figured it out already, this approach is not going very well. The roles on the cockpit aren't established, and it's not clear who's really in charge. Arturo is in the left seat, and he's the pilot in command, but at times it seems like Miguel is running the show. The truth is that if Miguel had previous experience in Aspen, he should have briefed the entire approach and ensured that the FMS was set up correctly. Unfortunately, they're still very high on the approach, and the situation is about to get worse. Listen to what happened next.
Wind 32012, gust 25. Runway 15 cleared to land.
Okay, when having the runway clear to land, and go your weather wind.
115 Whiskey Foxtrot, estimate. X-ray Alpha Victor Alpha Lima, when able turn left, join Alpha contact ground point Manor. Any wind shear?
Affirmative, we have like 20 knots wind shear Victor Alpha Lima.
Gain of 20?
Affirmative, yes.
November 115 Whiskey Foxtrot, Falcon just reported a gain of 20 knots. Use caution for low level wind shear.
Roger.
The tower reported the winds 320 at 12, gusting to 25 knots. That should have been a huge red flag because that means they're going to have a tailwind between 12 and 25 knots. The reason this is dangerous is because that increases their ground speed and it's going to reduce the amount of time they have to descend. However, the bigger concern is the maximum allowable tailwind for landing in this aircraft is only 10 knots. So as soon as they heard the winds, they should have verified those with the tower, taken a moment to run the calculation, and then immediately performed the missed approach. To make matters worse, they're also facing the possibility of wind shear with up to a 20-knot increase in airspeed, but they're not really paying attention, and Miguel is still trying to convince them that things are good and they just need to pull power. A few seconds later, Emilio recognized there was a problem because he told his brother they had a 30-knot tailwind and the other aircraft had 20-knot wind shear. But unfortunately, Miguel just kept telling them not to worry about it and just maintain their descent rate. Thankfully, when they got about 5 miles from the runway, common sense prevailed and Arturo finally realized that landing was impossible and he decided to execute a missed approach. Now, normally that would be the end of the story because they'd realize how dangerous that was and they'd just divert somewhere else. And the truth was that Eagle, Colorado was just 15 minutes away and the weather there was VFR and it would have been an easy landing, especially because Arturo had recently flown into Eagle, so he was familiar with the approach and diverting there should have been an easy decision. Unfortunately, they decided to do something else, and this would be one of the worst mistakes they made because it meant they only had a few minutes left before they would crash.
Okay, missed approach, November 115 Whiskey Fox. There's 33 knots of tailwind.
Number 5 Whiskey Foxtrot, climb and maintain a 16,000, expedite your climb, execute published miss to 16,000 on the miss.
We're executing climbing to 16,000.
Sure, 115 Whiskey Foxtrot, Aspen, departure, roger, stay in touch.
Okay, to return back and do another approach. We had a tailwind of 30 knots.
November 5 Whiskey Foxtrot, roger, flight heading 310, vector localizer, DME-E, echo press.
Even though they had a 30-knot tailwind, their plan was to try it again. Now, I'm not sure if they were waiting for Miguel to say something or if they were just so focused on landing that they ignored the obvious danger, and it's just shocking to me how despite the fact that they had thousands of flight hours, no one bothered to say, hey, this is a bad idea. And instead of talking about the tailwind or the wind shear, they spent the next 7 minutes trying to figure out how to load the FMS because the approach got erased when they flew it. They got vectored around for the approach pretty quickly, and when they were moments away from landing, Arturo finally mentioned the winds, but it seemed like he was hoping they would die down as they went through the mountains. Once again, Miguel tells him not to worry. Arturo continued to struggle to keep the aircraft under control as he flew the approach. The blue line represents his airspeed, and the green line, the engine power setting. Arturo was averaging about 140 knots during the approach, and you can see the rapid fluctuations in the power setting from 50 to 70% as he tried to control the airspeed with throttle movements. 90 seconds before impact, they got a final advisory from the tower about the winds.
November 115 Whiskey Foxtrot, wind 330 at 16, runway 15, cleared to land, 1 minute average 32014, gust 25.
Roger, 115 Whiskey Fox.
Moments later, they hit the runway, bounced into the air, and the aircraft reached about 25 degrees nose high before stalling and slamming into the ground, where it skidded off the runway, rolled over, and caught on fire. In the last 15 seconds before they hit the runway, Arturo started pitching the aircraft up and down, and he got himself into a PIO with the oscillations increasing all the way to impact. This was an unstabilized approach that got worse and worse, and he needed to neutralize the controls, select a go-around power setting, and perform the missed approach. I think the worst mistake on this flight was the flight crew's decision to pick Aspen as their destination. And I couldn't find any reason why they needed to be in Aspen, and they probably should have picked an easier airport considering they have very little experience in this aircraft. Miguel and Arturo survived the crash, but Emilio did not. And it's just tragic because I can't even imagine what it must be like to survive this tragedy knowing that your brother didn't. Now, my only hope is that Arturo can take some comfort knowing that talking about these mistakes will hopefully save someone else's life. If you want to see another example of a pilot that made a series of terrible mistakes while flying an instrument approach and actually joked with his passengers about crashing the plane, then be sure to watch this video on the screen, and thanks so much for your support.